Welcome, dear viewer, to this video about the Traitors. Before we go anywhere, there will likely be spoilers for any of this series I have watched so far, those being UK and Australia seasons 1 and 2, so please turn this off if you want to watch those first. Thank you. The BBC describes the Traitors thusly: get them before they get you. 22 strangers, 1 castle, £120,000. Claudia Winkleman hosts the ultimate reality game of trust and treachery. Let the mind games begin. So what is all the fuss about? And what makes this show the current marquee BBC show? Join me in Traitors Tower and help me as I try to piece together my thoughts on the Traitors. After having seen a few mentions on social media of the BBC show The Traitors and being threatened with the occasional trailer on iPlayer, me and Mrs. Inside Left decided to give it a go. Pitched as a sort of televised murder mystery in its trailer, this appealed to both of us, but especially the wife, who is rather fond of Agatha Christie and all things murder mystery. So the idea of a reality TV show pitched in a grandiose manor house, where contestants are actively participating in a whodunit, seemed right up her alley. And I must confess, I was intrigued too. I'd long left behind most reality TV game shows, with the exceptions of maybe Dragula and Drag Race, though even those had started to get a little tiresome and formulaic of late. So the idea of a new format gave me some hope of something relatively novel to enjoy. Upon watching the introduction of the UK Season 1 show, I was a little disappointed to discover that a lot of the usual competitive reality TV tropes were present. Team-based challenges, confessionals to the camera, melodramatic music, and an over-reliance on manipulative editing. But I was still willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, so long as it delivered on the skullduggery and intrigue that it had promised. The premise of the show was that 22 contestants, collectively known as the Faithful, don't worry, we'll come to that later, must complete a series of challenges to earn up to £120,000 over the course of several days, but that there will be a secret subgroup within them known as the Traitors. The Faithful must identify and banish the Traitors by the end of the season to win the prize money, and they can vote collectively to banish 1 contestant per day. The Traitors are selected by the show, and their job is to survive undetected until the end of the season, and if any of them do, they win the prize money between them, and the Faithful lose. The Traitors can remove 1 contestant each night, a murder, if you will, in order to further their own agenda. You therefore lose 2 contestants each episode, 1 chosen by the collective, and 1 by the Traitors. The show moves between set pieces, confessionals and roaming cameras as the contestants attempt to understand the game they are playing and try to identify those that they think might be a traitor. Naturally, there are all of the usual exceptions and twists you would expect of a reality TV show, but this general format is the heart of the show. I think we were about halfway through the first episode when things started to feel a little off about the show. The contestants had begun talking about strategies to survive, the traitors were selected and began doing the same, and very quickly it just all got a bit kill or be killed, and I was a little surprised at how quickly paranoia, self-interest and mutual distrust manifested themselves. There were a number of interesting elements added by the show that all seemed designed to further this hostility and to feed the alienation of the contestants. I just couldn't shake the feeling that the whole show had this really dark undercurrent of malice. The lifting yourself up on the bodies of the fallen attitude was adopted so fast and was just treated as a totally normal and socially acceptable approach to the game. You must be ruthless to succeed. Only the strong survive. It's survival of the fittest. So my cogs started turning, and I wondered to myself, is this all like a deliberate ideological statement? Is it some sort of gross Randian war game designed to promote competitive behaviour, even when against your collective interests? To sow distrust and suspicion amongst the population by showing these behaviours as effective and good, actually. This video is basically me thinking out loud. Thinking firstly about the traitors in probably excruciating detail, trying to pull out the bits that struck me as problematic, ideological, or manipulative in some way. Secondly, I will be thinking about games and game shows in general, and how they can both reflect the times and attitudes in which they are created, and be used to propagate and manipulate ideology. Lastly, I will look at the Traitors as a potential tool for leftist learning, and talk about what kind of game shows, mechanics and ideas could be a healthier fit for a leftist alternative. So come with me as we wander through the corridors of, well look, minor tangent. They call it a castle, but I mean it's not really a castle, is it? No drawbridge, no moat, no battlements, I don't care what they say, that's just a mansion. Pretty much a manor house, but it's no castle. You would have a battering ram through that in 5 minutes. Anyway, let's go. The Traitors' general premise is that each contestant is trying to remove all of the traitors, a minority who are selected to act as antagonists, and to accumulate a prize pot to be shared amongst those contestants who survive the whole season. At the end of the show, if any traitors do remain, it is they that steal the prize pot instead. The non-traitors are collectively known as the Faithful, and they effectively have 2 actions they must complete each day. A mission, where they will work together to win money for the end of season prize pot.
Craig's bollocks. Paul's bollocks.
Watch your back!
Alex did okay. But then she's bollocks. And Kate did okay, but then she bollocks as well.
And the round table, which is where the Faithful can attempt to remove a traitor from the game by discussing suspicions and then voting to banish a contestant.
It is difficult to take the emotions out of it. I don't care what anyone says. You know, I mean, can I just finish, please? You know, Andrea, you said very clearly there was no way you were going to vote Amos out.
No.
Exactly. So that's the motive thing.
Yes, I just couldn't ever.
Exactly. So there's some people here that are sitting around this table that feel exactly that way.
The Traitors operate secretly amongst the Faithful and meet up every evening to murder a Faithful contestant and permanently remove them from the game, with occasional opportunities to recruit other players to the Traitors' side.
Faye for me, right? Faye.
Dangerous.
Yeah, she's very, very dangerous.
But she's on our side. She adores the two of us. She
Yeah, she
genuinely
does.
does. Andrea's a threat.
Andrew's a massive threat.
She's going to be looking at the two of us, realistically.
Andrew's a threat, but at the same time, she's easily swayed by my opinion. She will not be banished.
And
Yeah.
We will have to murder her.
So to reiterate, at the end of the season, all traitors must be removed from the game for the Faithful to win. If any traitors do remain, the traitors win, and the Faithful get fuck all. Pretty simple, but the mechanics of the game are a fairly small part of the overall show, since this is a game show based around human interaction, communication and interpretation, all things that are hard to neatly quantify or measure. Since, as Jenny Nicholson is fond of saying, the internet enjoys an orderly numbered list, we will break our initial analysis of the show up into several aspects. Let us begin. Number 1. The premise. Let's think about language for a bit. Let's put those English GCSEs to good use. The Traitors is a name that is highly evocative and is designed to capture the imagination, to put potential viewers into the right mindset for the show. Straight away, the show is signalling that the focus of the show is subterfuge, skullduggery, and the betrayal of trust in the name of self-interest. In that way, it is a very well chosen name. It is set in a Scottish castle, a grandiose background with a mansion-like interior full of the trappings of old money. You know the kind of thing: dark wood furniture, taxidermy everywhere, old weapons and suits of armour, with players represented by portraits hanging in a decadently decorated dining room, next to a large painting of host Claudia Winkleman as a medieval royal. The lavish environment further embellishes the murder mystery vibe of the show's intro, where contestants are brought to the location via a steam train, harking back to the murder on the Orient Express and just general Agatha Christie era vibes, all of which helps to create the mystique that is used to market the show. This is actually kind of unhelpful, given that the mystery element is actually dispelled almost immediately, given that the identities of the traitors are revealed to the viewer from episode 1. This is an important element to consider. Why go to all the trouble to daub the show in the clothes of mystery and subterfuge but then remove all of that for the viewer. I think that in the main, there is a desire to illustrate a dissonance between the skills needed to succeed at being a traitor and the way that those skills are judged morally in the public eye. Lies, backstabbing and ruthlessness are all big elements of how we are told the traitors will succeed, and yet such behaviours are decried somewhat hypocritically by our media as distasteful and immoral, with perhaps one exception, a largely class-based exception. Politics, finance and business, in particular, are often talked about as arenas where the ability to demonstrate exactly those behaviours is treated as, at best, the norm, and at worst, laudable. Usually favoured values like honesty, transparency and kindness are treated as naive and sneered at as if representing a weakness, as we have seen levelled at Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn in previous election campaigns, for example. Greed is good, and all of the behaviours that stem from such a mentality are practically cheered when the professions being discussed are those of the upper classes. When you apply the same behaviours to someone of a lower background, you tend to get the stereotypes of the used car salesman, the door-to-door salesman and telesales. We are told that business people have to be ruthless to succeed, and that weakness will lead to companies failing. We are told that economists work removed from any consideration of the human element, relying instead upon the weird artificial construct that is the rational actor. Facts don't care about your feelings is the right-wing mantra popularised by Norman Bates's mini-me Ben Shapiro, and that is a phrase I want us to carry with us as we examine this show. Not because I am arguing feelings deserve an equal footing with facts. They probably should, incidentally, so long as we aren't using the feelings of a tiny American racist, but we should remember the phrase because of the facts part. Universally agreed facts are an incredibly rare thing, and the use of the word by brittle gremlins like Ben and the way that it is used in The Traitors both share the similarity that they are usually anything but facts. What is interesting about The Traitors is that we are taking nominally ordinary people, creating a minority within them, and then applying labels that both create an instant moral judgment and encourage the use of behaviours normally considered distasteful by ordinary folk. The ability to manipulate others, to create secret alliances and to brutally remove others from your path to victory are cheered by the show as being intellectual skills, whereas genuine trust, plain speaking and openness are treated as failings and again, naive. So the contestants not placed into The Traitors are collectively known as the Faithful, and this raises some interesting questions too. The setting of the UK show, being hosted as it is in a castle of sorts, and the monk-like hooded cowls worn by the Traitors, signal a religious medieval type setting further supported by the presence and regular inclusion of an old church nearby. However, there is not much done with religious iconography or language beyond that. Certainly there is no godly or spiritual element to the game or its mechanics, so the question then becomes, who are the faithful to? There is an implied moral judgment placed on the two contestant roles, those that conform to some form of societal expectation, the faithful, and those that undermine this for their own purposes, the traitors. Could it be that the show is structured to reinforce the importance of social cohesion, specifically the cultural significance of obeying the social rules and expectations that often go unsaid, something akin to the mythical British values perhaps? Or is it more interested in presenting the binary options of social conformity and deviance, with all of the moral weights that those concepts carry when paired with phrases like faithful and traitor? Given that the democratic removal of contestants from the game is referred to as a banishment, or effectively the enforced removal of an individual from a collective, an ostracism of sorts, this kind of reinforces that view. This can then look like enforcement of social norms, or a form of removing the weakest from a community, all depending on the way you choose to view it. Let's have a look at the structure of the show, and see what else it has to say. 2. The structure. The first day. The first episode begins with the contestants meeting each other on a steam train heading to the castle, and these early sequences give us glimpses of some of the characters we will be meeting over the course of the next episodes, but it's generally played in a friendly light. It's usually a sunny day, everything is vibrant and colourful. Once the contestants arrive at the castle, the mood begins to change, and they start off in episode 1 of the UK by asking the contestants to position themselves in a line on the front drive, with those most confident of winning at one end and those allegedly less so at the other. This is an interesting exercise. as this is before the traitors have been selected, as far as we know anyway, and is instead an insight into the different characters and the starting strategies that are presented to us. Is it better to out yourself as someone with a relatively high or low confidence in your own ability, especially in a show where the skills required for victory are a lot less clear than most seem to think? Should you be looking to hide in the middle of the pack and avoid standing out too much? Or should you be putting your stall out now as a big, confident personality and a potential leadership figure? Maybe you should be self-deprecating and stand at the least likely to win end to endear yourself to these strangers and hope that you are underestimated. As it is, in the first UK season, the 2 contestants at the least likely to win end of the line were removed from the game immediately in an attempt to show the ruthlessness and unpredictability of the show, and to set a precedent that all decisions have consequences.
Every decision you make, every single one, has a consequence. So you two, you think you're going to lose. I am going to take you at your word. So I'm afraid it's goodbye. I'd like you to leave the grounds immediately.
Apart from being compelling TV, this is also a good example of something called procedural rhetoric, a theory of game design that we will talk about a bit more later, but it is in essence using the rules of a game to illustrate an ideological point. In this instance, the show let you choose where to stand, thereby making your banishment sort of your own choice. If you chose to stand at the least likely to win end, then why are you here? Except none of that is strictly true, is it? A choice made without the full knowledge of the rules and consequences is not one that carries full responsibility. The game has engineered a situation that gives the impression of self-determination. You are either not confident in your own ability or were trying to hide your confidence, therefore you have removed yourself. In a way. But if you do not define the consequences, or even imply that there might be some, the weight of the outcome lies with the game's design, as opposed to the contestant's decision. In having a rule that removes the 2 least likely to win players, what is the game telling us? Is it potentially a reinforcement that self-confidence and ego is preferable to humility and self-deprecation as competitive behaviours? Or is it instead establishing a mindset that it is better to be at the top looking down rather than at the bottom looking up? Food for thought. The first group activity after the lineup is the selection of the traitors, where the contestants are blindfolded and the host, in the UK version Claudia Winkleman, circles the round table and squeezes the shoulder of those selected to be the traitors. We are not told how these people are chosen, what criteria are used, what the selection process was like before filming has begun, etc. But these traitors are then effectively selected as an antagonistic element, with them acting against the greater good of the faithful. They are later presented with a cowl and made to take the traitor's oath, which sets out what will be considered good behaviour for a traitor.
I'm going to need you to take the traitor's oath. Do you commit to lie and deceive throughout the game?
I do.
Are you willing to murder your fellow players every single night?
I am.
And do you vow to keep your identity and the identity of your fellow traitors a secret?
I do.
Then you are officially a traitor. Here is your cloak. You're now going to find out who your fellow traitors are, and then I'm going to need the name of the faithful you would like to enlist.
With the roles now allocated, the traitors select their first faithful to murder, based on little more than their initial interactions and an initial dislike, to be honest, given how little information there is available at the start. The becowled traitors meet at Traitor's Tower and discuss the potential candidates for murder before agreeing on a final candidate. The logic of these discussions tends to be some combination of, this person is a threat to us, this person's murder will not point to any of the traitors, and this person is not likely to be banished. Once the person is selected, they have to write the murder victim's name on a scroll, and then hand it off to the host. The results of the murder are not revealed to the viewer or the faithful until the morning, which is always at the start of the subsequent episodes, at least in the UK and Australian ones. Breakfast. Breakfast is the phase of the show where contestants are drip-fed into the dining room until all but one have arrived, and it becomes clear who has been murdered. An exercise in tension building, contestants tend to come in 2s and 3s initially, with those that were considered but not chosen for murder often sent in last and on their own. Once the missing party has been identified, it is usually around now when people begin judging each other's reactions, but without any real sense of what they are looking for, with challenges of X didn't seem surprised and Y didn't seem too upset, being the types of evidence offered against contestants later. The proximity of all the other contestants makes open conversation tricky, but little pockets do fire up occasionally, particularly in the UK version of the game where contestants sit along one side of a U-shaped breakfast table, meaning you can only really talk to those immediately next to you. The Australian version, however, uses a long rectangular table, which allows people to potentially talk across the table too, and it makes it harder to have conversations discreetly. Not that it stops them trying necessarily. Towards the end of breakfast, the host arrives, mourns the latest murder victim, and then drops a hint about today's mission, which we'll be talking about now, the missions. The least surprising or innovative element of the show is the presence of cash builder missions, in which the contestants work to earn money for the final prize, usually competing in a puzzle or physical challenge in the tradition of many TV reality shows. This part is probably the most positive element of the show, with contestants working together to achieve the highest possible total, since it theoretically works in the interest of all to achieve as much as possible. In the UK show, a few episodes into season 1, they introduced the idea that there will be opportunities to win shields on missions, or perhaps just a chance to enter the armoury for a chance to win a shield. In the UK show's logic, if a contestant possesses a shield, they are protected from being murdered that evening, though they can still be banished at the round table as normal. This element allows them to pitch teams against each other in missions, since there is now an incentive to be won, namely access to the armoury for the winning team. The addition of shields to the missions also reintroduces some of the subterfuge and potential conflict that would be otherwise missing from this section of the show, and which would undermine the survival of the fittest, win at any cost mentality that underpins the more social aspects of the show. Indeed, one of the big changes from season 1 of the UK Traitors to season 2 was the way that shields began to be offered in a way that would require contestants to neglect the main mission to get them, adding a further element of prioritising self-interest over group benefit. This form of mechanical manipulation is designed to encourage specific behaviours and removes any doubt of the show's intentions.
I'm gonna go for it. We need someone to row me!
I'm only in day 1. I need to get as far as possible. When I grabbed that shield, I was absolutely buzzing.
You traited us, Jazz! Come on, keep going. Don't worry about Jazz. He ain't coming back on our boat.
In the Aussie season 2, they took this approach even further, encouraging contestants to sacrifice cash from the mission in return for a chance at winning a shield, or even just a small luxury, on the basis that their deceit would not be revealed to the other contestants.
What?
Each of you were offered a few additional items at a very reasonable price of 1 silver bar each. 8 silver bars.
What?
Leaving you with a total of $18,000, and the 16 here, unfortunately, you will never see again.
Once the mission is complete, often with the contestants bonding and feeling relatively positive, they return to the castle to unwind ahead of the show's marquee event, the Round Table. The Round Table is where it all kicks off. Banishment is the only weapon that the faithful have to fight back against the traitors, with a democratic majority able to vote a contestant, any contestant mind, out of the game once per day. The contestants sit around a circular table, and everyone can examine the faces and body language of the other contestants as discussions get underway. The format is very simple. Contestants raise their suspicions, those accused are given an opportunity to defend themselves, and then each contestant writes the name of someone they suspect of being a traitor onto a piece of slate with a piece of chalk, before then being asked to reveal who they have chosen and provide a brief explanation as to why. We will go into more detail as to some of the more interesting observations about this section, but suffice to say, things can quickly become very tense, and situations that seem nailed on in discussions prior to the round table can fall by the wayside as somebody does something unexpected. I'm looking at you, Brian.
Can I have a really selfish moment? Try and be quick because I've realised this was going to end soon. Anyone here else that thinks or is version towards I am or amn't? I would like to hear maybe more towards the I amn't. What's happening? What's happening? Oh, sorry. So, is there anyone here to clarify for me that thinks that I am not?
So you've just called the whole room out to just talk about you.
I want to know people's opinions.
If it was a bit deflected, dude.
Oh, shit. No, because
The time for talk is over. I need you.
Once the votes are counted, the contestant with the most votes stands up from the table and reveals whether they are indeed a traitor or a faithful, and leaves the competition. Now, the either jubilant
Congratulations, faithful. You got one.
or crestfallen
Faithful, you have lost one of your own.
contestants retire to the castle to scheme and review the day's events before heading back to their rooms and awaiting news of the latest murder at breakfast the next day, starting the cycle anew. Traitors Tower. Surviving traitors meet in Traitors Tower again and either choose to murder, or if their numbers have fallen below their starting quantity, they can choose to recruit a faithful to join their ranks. The murder works the same as I described on the initial day, with the traitors usually working on the logic of removing people unlikely to be banished, unlikely to be linked back to one of them, and likely to be someone that is deemed to be a threat to the traitors for one reason or another. Recruitment is an interesting element, as usually, but not always, the offer of recruitment is exactly that, an offer. The contestant receives a letter asking if they would like to join the traitors, but they can choose to reject the invitation, which creates an interesting dilemma. You don't know who the traitors are, and you having been invited is a fact, but one that you have no way of proving to the other faithful, so rejection is risky since you may end up the target of the next murder. But joining the traitors mid-game is also full of risk, since they will have pre-established relationships and motives, and there have been a number of recruitments that have turned out to simply be a way of creating banishment fodder.
Attack right up. Oh.
No, you're all good. You're fine.
Yeah. Chuck me under the bus.
No, I promise you it's not that. Letting everyone else, all the faithfuls, argue between each other. They'll all vote each other out. And then in 3 or 4 days, we're in the final.
Oh, yeah. You're not going to believe you or anything.
Trust me.
Yeah. Trust you.
This single-minded ruthlessness is treated by the show as being an effective behaviour for traitors, with human beings being used like chess pieces and then discarded when their usefulness is over. This feels almost corporate and very neoliberal. Workers are, after all, just disposable assets to big economic players. And that is true here too, with players that are physically or mentally skilled often being kept in the game longer for their ability to contribute to the prize fund, and then killed off once closer to the finale. Speaking of which, the UK version of The Traitors has an established formula for its finale. After the usual routine, the remaining contestants are asked to vote to either end the game or to run another banishment if they believe there are still traitors present. If any traitors remain once the game is ended, they win the entire prize pot from under the faithful's nose, so the tension is high. And this is where the relationships contestants have built throughout the course of the show are revealed to either be genuine or simply tools that were used to further individual agendas.
I am very proud to say that I have been from the start of the game and will lead this game as a proud faithful. Faithful, faithful, faithful! Oh, no.
I'm a traitor, Craig.
So that's the game.
The finale reveals the truth that no matter how much teamwork and camaraderie led to this moment, a single person acting out of their own interest can prevail, leaving the others with nothing. Trust is a weakness. Ruthlessness wins. 3. The contestants. Throughout the course of the show, we meet a whole bunch of contestants from all walks of life, except for Australia's Season 1, which seemed to be populated almost entirely by lawyers and law students from what I can remember. We meet soldiers, magicians, educators, doctors, actors, a mixture of genders, ethnicities, sexualities and ages, and we get to hear a little bit about what each of them thinks is a winning strategy. Bearing in mind that facts are in extremely short supply, it is interesting to see how the contestants act when they are asked to begin casting suspicions without any real, tangible information. The interesting thing about labelling a subset of people as traitors, apart from all of the moral judgment that it directly infers, is that it is effectively a form of othering. Othering is this fun thing that fascists love, where you point at someone and say, they are different from you, so how can you trust them? And then basically blame any and all problems on them. Now hold on. I am not calling the show fascist. I reserve that judgment for the Predator. What we are actually talking about is a race of space-bound colonial slavers that have a culture based on racial purity, violence, and a generally low opinion of any race they consider as beneath them. Can you see where I'm going with this? But this othering of the traitors creates some interesting behavioural changes in the faithful, and to some degree to the traitors too. When you spend some time with the faithful and they begin discussing their logic for identifying traitors, the language being used is curious. It would appear that by applying a label, by othering each other, it allows this sort of weird absolutist talk of how traitors act differently, or how someone's behaviour has changed from before the selection of the traitors, for example. It's as if the applying of the label is literally transformational, with people becoming significantly changed by it. That's foreshadowing, by the way. In the absence of genuine evidence or facts, we start to see the boundaries of those words become soft, with people using facial expressions or even the lack of them as evidence.
And I have seen a few times that there seems to be a change in demeanour since the day we met on the platform. Like, you were so happy and so bubbly.
Really?
It just ringing in my head is someone cracking under a little bit of pressure there.
Who you voted for 3 episodes ago might be used as a fact against you, or the fact that you may have reacted in a way deemed strange or melodramatic at some point.
When Ian left and announced he was a faithful, you gave a reaction, which was to fling your arms in the air. Oh my God, I can't believe it. I'm gutted. We got rid of another faithful. You never really cared about Ian.
The key thing here is that the show is demonstrating how, in the absence of actual information, we fill in the void with our own information, and how quickly this collection of I thinks and I reckons can become a groupthink that identifies and targets an individual, all because they seem shifty.
I think there's going with gut feeling and then there's going with evidence. Just the one thing is that when we all raised our glass to the faithful, the other day you didn't raise your glass, and that's the only thing.
The regular use of terms like evidence and facts are almost oxymoronic, since every single element of the reasoning is subjective. It's like a microcosm of the witch hunts of the 17th century, where suspicion and deviation from social expectation is all that was needed to create a hysteria and a collective certainty of someone's guilt. Indeed, I often joke with the wife that in the first few episodes of The Traitors, the worst thing you can do is have people know who you are, since standing out tends to result in banishment early on.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for not voting me out. Can I just have 30 seconds of your time? And just remember, MK is on team faithful, okay?
And so it is done. With 16 votes, the majority believe MK is a traitor.
Furthermore, prejudices and preconceptions definitely play a part in what people consider suspicious. The lack of viable information can often lead to a subconscious groupthink that will reflect the dominant characteristics of the majority. That's a mouthful. Indeed, as noted in this January article from Amanda Parker at the New European, tropes associated with race, even if unconscious, seem to rear their head even before the game begins. Diane, who is white, middle-aged and TV gold, decides Anthony, black and a chess coach from Birmingham, is a traitor, because before the traitors were selected, he wouldn't allow her to stand in the spot he'd chosen. Describing him as uncooperative, Diane literally objected to him standing his ground. Later, Kyra, a black woman, was voted out as she was deemed dominant, a dog whistle heard by just about every non-white female viewer. This makes for some interesting observations about subconscious bias, and how when there is nothing else to go on, people will go via good old prejudice. After all, if we are building a show about a majority seeking to hunt down a minority within them, majority characteristics can quickly become synonymous with a sort of innate belonging, or even a form of social norm. So, all of this begs the question, why does this show exist? Well, to understand that, we will need to go back to the beginning and examine the origins of the game and then the show, who came up with them and what their motivations were. So off we go to 1980s Russia to check in on an interesting character named Dmitri. To understand the ideas inherent to the Traitors, it is important to go back to the origin of the game itself, and that means travelling back in time to 1986 to meet Russian psychology undergrad Dmitry Davidov in Moscow. Not much is really known about Davidov, beyond them being the author of the game Mafia, as part of their psychology research, and that they were looking to create a scenario with as few artificial restraints as possible to explore the value of information and trust. If we look at the rules of the original game, we can see how this dynamic is created and gather some sense of the intent of its creator. Each player gets one card from the prepared and shuffled deck, secretly looks at the card's colour and returns the card to the deck. Then everybody closes their eyes and lowers their heads. Someone starts counting aloud until 20. The players who received black cards should open their eyes, raise their heads and look at each other, then close their eyes and lower their heads again. Mafia are the players who saw each other and therefore know each other. Honest people are the players who saw nothing, don't know each other and don't know who the Mafia members are. This is the only advantage of the Mafia. They know each other. Honest players have to suspect everybody, but they have an advantage of being the majority. The main struggle during the next phase will be between the informed minority and the uninformed majority. The core purpose of the game is for the honest players to work out who the Mafia are and then remove them, first by publicly accusing them and then providing a case for why they are believed to be Mafia, whilst at the same time the Mafia seek to remove the honest players from the game. Davidov suggests Mafia members have to hide their identity and pose as honest players in order to manipulate the other team players towards self-destruction. It is in each player's best interest to prove his or her innocence, or if you're a Mafia member, to hide your guilt by accusing and interrogating their fellow suspects until all members of the opposing team are eliminated from the game. Once a player is publicly accused, all players can make their case for or against their execution, and then all players vote on the accused player's guilt. If a majority is achieved, that player is removed from the game and executed. But, and this is a key difference from the TV show, they do not reveal whether or not they were indeed Mafia at this time. The only surefire way to find out whether you have been successful in removing the Mafia from your midst is to call for a night phase. Now, the night phase has all players submit a scrap of paper which contains either the word honest if they are part of the honest, or, and here's where it gets interesting, if you are Mafia, you write the name of a player you want to murder. In this way, you discover the number of Mafia remaining, and if all the Mafia have written the same player name, that player is removed from the game, having been murdered by the Mafia. Tellingly, this remains true even if only one Mafia remains, meaning that a lone mafioso is a very dangerous thing indeed. And thus the game continues on, with a series of accusations, executions and murders until either a night phase happens with no attempt at murder, or all honest players are removed from the game. One of the key differentiations between this original rule set and the TV show is the way that the Mafia murder. It requires coordination and communication, all under the nose of the honest, and an additional layer of skullduggery since there is no separate safe space for them to discuss and confirm their final decision. Let us also not forget that anything less than a unanimous vote results in no murder taking place, but with the honest gaining information about the number of remaining Mafia. This puts a large onus on the accusations as a tool for removing players, since every round is guaranteed to have accusations, but that is not true for the night phase, which as a reminder must be called for by the players. This effectively reduces the killing power of the Mafia and makes the information they hold, the identities of the other Mafia members, even more important to the strategy of the game. And again, it is important to repeat this. This game is about the importance of information above and beyond all else, as per this from Davidov in the game's Pointers for Beginners. Accidental or purposeful peeking during the process of selecting the Mafia should be discouraged. However, it will not give any advantage during the game. The trick of the game is always to persuade others to accept your knowledge and never to have the knowledge per se. Included in the rule set I have seen are snippets from writer Adam Gopnik's 2006 autobiography Through the Children's Gate, where they summarise this point rather nicely. The ostensible pleasure of the game lies in testing your own skills as a dissembler and as a spotter of dissemblers, in lying and spotting liars. Both eager cooperation and absolute paranoia are essential to the strategic game. Yet the really fascinating thing about Mafia is seeing how much pure irrationality lingers in its play, how little real deduction and how much sheer panic govern its conduct. The game quickly breaks down, as social groups will, into small circles of belief which become lynch mobs of distrust on the next turn. There is precious little info that I can find on Davidoff's specific intent and why this game was put together the way it was, but it is interesting that Mafia was chosen as the narrative angle, given the many different clothes these rules could have been dressed in. Mafia implies secrecy, it implies greed, it implies violence, but it also seeds that it is not the ultimate power in its own narrative, seeing as how the Mafia are always being pursued and persecuted by the state. It occurs to me that this game would work equally well with spies or secret police, and that this might have added a political angle to the game that might have added some interesting nuance. But I think we also need to acknowledge that as a student in Moscow, Davidoff might not have fancied creating a psychological study in game with a name that might provoke state interest from a state that some might say was already experiencing some level of its own paranoia. Werewolf. Davidoff's Mafia game spread widely, largely led by students according to Wikipedia anyway, and started to generate interest across Europe and the US, where it was found by interactive fiction author Andrew Plotkin, who enjoyed the game but felt the narrative was a tad dry. Plotkin was attending the 1997 National Puzzlers League convention when they had come across the game in a slight variant from the original, and became infatuated with the game, though he felt there were some quality of life changes that could make the game a bit more accessible. The obvious change made was in the name and the setting of the game, with antagonists now being werewolves and the others villagers. The dynamic essentially remains the same, and perhaps makes a more colourful and literal approach to the day and night cycle of the game, with the werewolves coming out at night and eating the villagers, then attempting to hide in plain sight during the day. This slight amendment of mindset creates a more predatory feel to the game, and I wonder if that influences the way it plays out perhaps, given that the antagonists are no longer simply people in possession of additional information, but instead a wholly other species with powers all their own. The other key additions that Plotkin added were the roles of moderator, which is pretty much a purely administrative role, and the seer, who is able to glean information about the werewolves during the night phase, though they can't reveal their own role without endangering their life. The addition of a moderator is one, I imagine, born out of practice, and the need for an impartial arbiter and organiser for games, particularly with new players, and doesn't really change too much mechanically, though it could perhaps be seen as a faint ideological indicator when considering that the socialist-raised Davidoff entrusted the running of the game to the collective, and the US and capitalism-born Plotkin needing an authority figure and an innate hierarchy. But that's probably too simplistic an observation, to be honest, and that's just part of me being a silly old cynic. The seer, however, is a significant change to the dynamics of the game, creating a role for the majority that can gather information, something denied to them in the original Mafia game. In terms of the flow of the game, Werewolf creates a number of rule changes that will be familiar to viewers of the Traitors, such as instilling a regular day and night cycle, as opposed to the voluntary night phase of the Mafia originator. Also gone is the need for the Mafia, or werewolves in this case, to covertly coordinate in plain sight and risk voting at cross purposes, thereby losing their chance to murder. Indeed, in a night phase, all players now close their eyes, and the werewolves agree and indicate via gestures to the moderator the player they want to kill, ensuring a kill happens every game cycle, making time a much bigger consideration than in the original. Additionally, after the werewolves have done the deed and closed their eyes, the seer becomes active. The seer may silently indicate a player to the moderator, who then confirms with a thumbs up or thumbs down whether that player is a werewolf. At the beginning of the day cycle, the moderator announces the victim of the night's murder, and the players begin the process of selecting someone to be executed or banished, to use the vernacular of the TV show. Unlike in Mafia, where any number of accusations and executions could be performed between night phases, Werewolf installs the strict one banishing per day that is now used by the TV show. This gives the game a more balanced feel, with one player exiting the game per day phase and one per night phase. The last major change to call out is the werewolves' end state, which goes from total annihilation of the villagers, as per Mafia, to simply getting the number of villagers down to the same number as there is werewolves, since in its narrative setting they can just openly kill the villagers without fear of persecution. The changes made by Plotkin certainly make for a tighter and smoother game experience, and are perhaps indicative of the difference in intent and expertise between Davidoff, a psychologist, and Plotkin, a game designer. The result is arguably a better game, though perhaps with a somewhat diluted intent or message. It is a game that has transformed from being about insider knowledge and manipulation to hunting and surviving hunts. And though each version has elements of both, there is now a much larger moral judgment being made, I feel. Werewolf is the version that took the game to even larger heights, particularly in the US, and as a result was the main influence on the TV show. The Dutch one, I mean. Die Verraders. In 2021, Die Verraders, apologies for pronunciation, was broadcast in the Netherlands and put in place the hallmarks of the other varieties to come. It was this version that came up with the Traitors for the name and the antagonists, and the Getrouw, or Faithful, for the innocent, for example, with a huge narrative shift being integrated with a simple swap of words. The power of language is important here. The Mafia, though criminal, were predominantly about power and wealth. Murder was a tool, but not their primary goal. And werewolves were little more than animals, behaving as the instinctual predators that they were. The Traitors, however, have an altogether lower status. Betrayal is one of the lowest acts in human behaviour, denigrated as it is through Christian mythology in the story of Adam and Eve, or in Judas's betrayal of Jesus. In this country, we spit the word traitor with a usually more patriotic tinge, conjuring up images of World War II spies and collaborators, or those selling national secrets for money. Our Dutch forebears created the premise of competing in prize-building games to generate the pot of the money. They created the idea of using a winnable shield to protect the bearer from murder that evening, and the idea of a round-table discussion ahead of voting on the banishment of a contestant on the pretense that they were, perhaps, a traitor. They created the setting of a castle complete with medieval trappings and decor, and instigated the idea of traitors meeting of an evening to decide on their victim, and the revelation of that choice by the absence of a contestant the following morning. So a lot of the work had been done by the Dutch progenitor, though the ending of the show in the Netherlands was something they iterated on, moving from a Golden Balls style finale with the two remaining contestants voting to share or steal the prize, as per the wiki. The two finalists independently wrote down either the word verraad, betrayal, or trouw, faithful. If both chose trouw, then they split the prize, but if one person chose verraad, then that person won all the silver bars. If both chose verraad, then the runner-up won all the silver bars. We will be touching on this type of game mechanic a bit later, the prisoner's dilemma, but for now it's enough to know that they moved away from it. As it was, a faithful and a traitor ended up sharing the prize pot in De Verrader's first season, making something of a mockery of the show's premise. This also seems quite a long way from the original intent of Davidoff, and a slightly curt ending to the frills and spills of the show. The third, most recent season of De Verraders ended using the format now used in the UK show, with the finalists voting to end the show when they were confident that no traitors remained, with any remaining traitors then winning the prize pot entirely. So we've spoken a lot about the intent of Davidoff's original creation, and of Plotkin's adaptation of the rules to make a better game out of it. So what do we know about the intent of the TV show? Well, Dutch producer Mark Poz explains the genesis of the idea in an interview with Variety in January of 2023. The starting point was a book I read in 2014, which was about an old 17th century vessel in the Netherlands which crashed into an island and led to a mutiny. It was a real story, and those people killed each other. Nobody knew at that time when they came to the island who was in favour of the mutiny and who wasn't. The core of this story is that people didn't trust each other, and what it said is that people can't live in a dishonest world. I started thinking about how to create a world where people can't trust each other, and put them in a bubble. A bit further on, they elaborate on the theme, and why it might be resonating so much, with 20 countries now producing their own versions. I think the concept captures the zeitgeist of our society today. We're living in a world where social media is more and more present. What can we trust? And who can we trust? And finally, the psychology behind it is that the hand that can help you climb the mountain can kill you the next night. Perhaps most tellingly of all was the last quote used in the article, in response to a specific question about whether the show will work in the US. And I want you to really think about the implications of the words here. I'm very confident it will work because it's about the worst qualities of humankind, and I think the Americans are not excluded from this sentiment. So there are some interesting inferences to be drawn here, starting with the continuation of the moral judgment on the minority, whether they are dubbed mafia, effectively criminals, werewolves, thereby predators, or mutineers, which in this case became traitors. We have gone from those that reject law and order, to those that reject civility and humanity, to those that reject honour and community. The nature of the original game Mafia precludes us from ever really examining why the Mafia exists, why there is a market for the criminality they participate in, or why their activities in any way would threaten ordinary folk. Likewise, the existence of werewolves as the minority somewhat robs us of anything interesting to say, doesn't it? Werewolves are part animal, predators that hunt and kill without conscience or mercy, so surely we can feel okay with their demonization as a minority. Yeah, maybe. Though of course, werewolves, shapeshifters, and many traditional monsters are often regarded as surrogates or metaphors in traditional storytelling for persecuted communities of one kind or another, as stated much more eloquently here by Socademia in their Medium article, Feminist Monster Theory. Essentially, werewolves are hybrids, embodying two species within one persona, similarly to how some queer folk embody two genders, or some fluid form of sexuality. Werewolves defy societal norms, in much the same way as the LGBTQ community defies gender roles. They go on to quote author Caitlin Giacopassi, when an individual species is in constant flux, how can its representations of gender or sexuality remain static? Now, to be clear, I'm not accusing Plotkin of picking an antagonist minority because of its theoretical or implied ties to LGBT communities, but I am keen to point out that there is still a judgment on the antagonist that goes beyond their actions. Finally, we come to the mutineers, who would eventually become the traitors. Now, mutiny comes with a few elements of interest to us. Firstly, mutiny as a phrase and indeed as a crime was invented by those in power to damn those who seek to overthrow it. As summarised nicely on Wikipedia, mutiny does not necessarily need to refer to a military force and can describe a political, economic or power structure in which subordinates defy superiors. I do believe we've uncovered some class conflict, dear Watson. A quick bit of Googling has led me to believe that the book TV show creator Mark Poz was referencing was Batavia's Graveyard, the true story of the mad heretic who led history's bloodiest mutiny by Welsh historian and author Mike Dash. The book was a historical account of the Dutch East India Company's flagship that was transporting precious cargo when mutiny struck and the ship ran aground on a series of tiny islands. As 250 survivors washed ashore, it wasn't clear who was a mutineer and who wasn't, and hence the uninformed majority were at the mercy of the informed minority, and many were killed in the confusion. The book's angle appears to be that the mutiny was orchestrated by a single charismatic individual who was greedy and wanted the gold and treasures aboard, judging by the book summary anyway. He was Geronimus Cornelissen, a disgraced and bankrupt man with great charisma and dangerously heretical ideas. With the help of a few disgruntled sailors, he hatched a plot to seize the ship and her riches. Plots, heresy, disgrace. Now, quite apart from my loathing of the great men of history theory, the idea that a few individuals were able to shape massive historical events with little or no consideration of the material conditions underpinning global events, it is important to note a few elements about the author here. Mike Dash is a Cambridge-educated author, with a series of book titles from 2002 to 2009 that maybe clue us into his worldview a little bit. We have Batavia's Graveyard, the true story of the mad heretic who led history's bloodiest mutiny. Then we have Thug, the true story of India's murderous cult. We have Satan's Circus, murder, vice, police corruption and New York's trial of the century. And we have The First Family, terror, extortion and the birth of the American Mafia. Mr. Dash appears to be something of a fan of law and order, wouldn't you say? We have a mutiny, a cultural phenomena weaponized and allegedly invented by the British Empire against the natives of India, a criminal dynasty, and a book on organised crime. Mafia indeed. Interesting that those first two books are pro-colonial on the face of things, and the use of cult when describing the thugs of India, when paired with the heretical adjective used in the Goodreads description, suggests that perhaps there's an overly Western Christian view of the events described in the books. Now, a lot of this is conjecture. I'm basing a lot of this on book titles, descriptions and topics, and I'm sure Mike Dash is a lovely person and not a raging pro-colonial Jesus zealot. But it's important we understand the implication of labelling the informed minority as part of a moral judgment. Mark Poz's personal feelings about humanity are also perhaps illuminating in the context of all this. They read about the murder of sailors in a mutiny, written by somebody who seemingly seems quite defensive of colonisers and who writes on the side of law and order by all accounts, and their first instinct to recreate those behaviours was, and I quote, to create a world where people can't trust each other and put them in a bubble. This is a game show designed to create an artificial bubble that breeds distrust and conflict, and all built around the premise that greed is both a motivator and ultimately a justification for any actions taken. It seeks to create a social situation where the optimal solution is proposed to be hyper-selfishness, focusing only on the satisfaction of the individual. The show wants contestants to lie, to betray, to accuse, and to sublimate all inclinations to personal greed. And this is a sentiment we have heard before. But The Traitors is just a game show, right? It's not like game shows are a particular weapon of ideology or anything, right? Game shows as a weapon of ideology. In 2019, Lauren O'Neill wrote the following tagline for Vice.com under an article entitled "How Game Shows Perfectly Reflect the Era We're Living in." From Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and the capitalistic optimism of New Labour to the chase and austerity Britain, game shows mirror our political climate like nothing else. Now, this article is well worth a quick read in general, as it covers a few of the topics we will be looking at, so do check the sources in the description of this video. Given what we've been talking about so far, where we have examined the origins of the Traitors from the angle of looking specifically at the iterations of the game and the intentions of those iterators, it makes sense to cast our net wider and ask ourselves, what is the deal with game shows? Lauren O'Neill makes some important observations on this subject that we will use as a starting point. Game shows have always rewarded individuals. As such, they prize aptitude in a manner that mirrors the system we all move around in. That is, capitalism. The changing rewards and natures of these game shows can certainly be traced, as observed by O'Neill, throughout the 80s, 90s and the 2000s. And it is this last quote I will use from O'Neill which starts to paint a picture of the symbiotic relationship between game shows and ideology. The emphasis of the Conservative government has not been on people bolstering each other in times of need, but on individuation, both personal and national. It's no wonder that the TV game shows we consume for light entertainment simulate the prevailing political and social temperature as real-time products of our society. It's simply what they've done for decades. The one problem that I do have with O'Neill's piece, hinted at before that quote, is that I do not feel you can treat game shows as an entirely passive medium. Much like the journalist that shrugs and says, "I just report the news," this attitude ignores the reality of both their influence and their reach, with reality game shows like Pop Idol, Bake Off and Big Brother getting 10 to 15 million viewers in the UK at times, and fully capturing the national conversation during those moments. There is a reason that shows like The Generation Game, Family Fortunes, Bullseye and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire are remembered so clearly and repeated sometimes even decades after they went out on the air. And that is because they represent a tangible and recognisable slice of history, and a message that was being communicated. There is a reason, for example, why the show is called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and not Who Wants to Win £1,000,000, since the show was selling you a vision of life that exists for a different class of people. It was closely tied in with the aspirational social mobility that Blair and co. were selling in the late 90s and early 2000s. The idea that it's not having the money that was desirable so much as the change in social standing, and the idea that you were now a millionaire. It's this thinking that makes Noel Gallagher the worst of the two Gallaghers, incidentally. The other shows that spring to mind from around this time are The Apprentice and Dragon's Den, the British versions of which both launched in 2005 on the BBC. These shows both represented a vision of improving your material conditions by grovelling to your betters, with contestants of Dragon's Den pitching their business ideas to the millionaire dragons in return for an unfavourable investment, and contestants of The Apprentice sucking up to Alan Sugar in the hope of getting a job being his full-time lickspittle. In both instances, people were asked to prostrate themselves before these superhuman business wizards and allow themselves to be judged, insulted, and often yelled at in return for either an investment deal heavily weighted in the investor's favour or a shite job working for a shite person. What could the message be here, I wonder? And I mean, these shows were huge, broadcast as they were by the BBC on mainstream channels at mainstream times. There is no denying the cultural power present in a well-polished reality game show presented by the national broadcaster and talked about on all of the news and current affairs TV shows of the day. These shows made celebrities of a load of chances, assholes and frauds and helped to push the narrative that to be successful you need to be ruthless, cutting and prepared to sacrifice your dignity. Let us not forget that this is how we got Katie Hopkins. Time moved on, and as it turned out, betting the house on the finance sector at the cost of all other considerations saw us stung when the 2008 subprime collapse kicked in and the UK turned to the Tories for salvation. They responded by implementing an austerity programme responsible for countless thousands of deaths and generally killing social mobility as a concept, instead making everyone fight each other for the scraps that were left after the business classes had their fill. This desperation and vilification of poverty led to the popularisation of Benefit Street and similar poverty safari TV programmes designed to pour scorn on the least fortunate in society and keep everyone punching down. As hopes for a better life became more distant and desperation became a larger motivator than aspiration for many, so the game shows changed too, with some of the more popular offerings no longer guaranteeing a winner at the end of the episode, usually for a decreasing prize pot and a generally less hopeful outlook. The 2020s feel kind of like an undeath, with the UK dragging its zombie economy around as it tries to find new things to demonise, consume or privatise, hamstrung as it is by austerity having destroyed virtually every institution, service or industry. Competition, freedom and choice are the words we hear our government and the main opposition chanting at us, all whilst we forlornly ask for functioning public services or just a country where we stopped keeping asylum seekers on prison barges or sending them to Rwanda. The current Tory mindset is one of survival of the fittest for the working classes, this never being more exemplified than by our approach to COVID, where Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock effectively threw our elderly and vulnerable to the metaphorical wolves, all whilst Captain Tom's kids plan to do exactly the same with their beleaguered old cash cow, all whilst using his likeness to build themselves a spa and the world's most cursed armchair. Thus, a country full of people competing amongst themselves for jobs, homes and healthcare is presented with a TV show that not only presents us with a similar scenario, but outright encourages destructive behaviours and rewards those who reject ideas of camaraderie, kindness and sharing. Game creation theory. Along with the way that a game show can use language, presentation and mood to present an ideology to its audience, the very rules of a game themselves can be used to create a certain outcome or to favour certain kinds of tactics. In a discussion about how games can be ideological in their design, fellow lefty creator Heather O'Draws from Instagram pointed me in the direction of procedural rhetoric, which is a sort of theory that describes how game design can be as prone to ideological intent as any medium, as per this from Wikipedia. Procedural rhetoric analyses the art of persuasion by rule-based representations and interactions rather than spoken or written word. Procedural rhetoric focuses on how game makers craft laws and rules within a game to convey a particular ideology. This theory was presented by Ian Bogost in their book Persuasive Games, The Expressive Power of Video Games, and was an attempt to explain that the way we construct a game will influence the behaviours that are used by those experiencing it. Indeed, as referenced later in the same Wikipedia article, similarly, procedural rhetoric would apply to board games such as Elizabeth Magee's The Landlord's Game, a forerunner of Monopoly that was designed to educate players on the negative outcomes of capitalism. Monopoly is, of course, a game which is designed to end in a very specific way, funneling money and properties towards a single player, teaching the ruthlessness of capitalism and its tendency towards monopoly and rentierism. It doesn't need to preach about the evils of greed, landlordism or exploitation, it simply engineers a series of rules that lead you to see that for yourself. Another good example of this theory in action would be to look at the ITV game show Golden Balls, which ran from 2007 to 2009, and that included a finale between two contestants where they would be offered to split or steal the prize fund, much like the original season of The Varadas. It was essentially a game show version of The Prisoner's Dilemma, an example or learning tool used to teach game theory. In The Prisoner's Dilemma, there are two prisoners being offered a lesser sentence if they are willing to sell out the other, with the caveat that if they both tried to sell out the other, they would be punished more severely. They are unable to communicate and so are only able to anticipate what their partner in crime might do when faced with the same scenario. As summarised handily on Wikipedia, the outcomes are as follows. Scenario 1. If A and B both remain silent, they will each serve 1 year in prison. Scenario 2. If A testifies against B, but B remains silent, A will be set free while B will serve 3 years in prison. Scenario 3. If A remains silent but B testifies against A will serve 3 years in prison and B will be set free. Scenario 4. If A and B testify against each other, they will each serve 2 years. Now, this is not supposed to be a riddle or a puzzle to be solved, but instead is used as an example of the correct tactic, that being for the prisoner to always take the deal and betray the other. The logic being that the cost of staying loyal is potentially the worst, that being the 3-year prison sentence if you are betrayed, and the reward is only the second best of those available, that being a mutual 1-year sentence. If you betray your partner in crime, you have potentially the best possible outcome available to you, that being walking away free, and only the second worst sentence if your partner betrays you. This game is designed to teach you something. It is engineered to produce an end result that fits the intent of its creators. It was not created this way to ensure it is a balanced or fair game, quite the opposite in fact. Returning to the game show Golden Balls, it used this set of game mechanics to effectively end the show, but instead of prison sentences, the players are asked whether they want to share the prize pot or steal it all for themselves. Naturally, however, if both players decide to try and steal, neither wins.
Promise you, I will make the same decision with you. Can't be more straightforward and honest than that.
I'm going to ask you to choose a split or a steal ball now.
I've made my decision. I'm choosing this ball.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Steve, Tracy. Split or steal?
Working on exactly the same basis as with the Prisoner's Dilemma, the biggest reward comes from stealing, and the worst punishment is the same whether you split or steal, so logically it makes sense for players to always steal. But wait, something is different here, isn't it? The Prisoner's Dilemma was effectively a teaching aid, an example of how game theory can work. It wasn't really an actual game. It was a scenario that illustrated how picking the optimal strategy would lead players to always betraying each other, and the makers of the game show picked that as the means for deciding the final outcome of their show. Curious, huh? But could I do any better? What would a socialist game show be like anyway? And is everything about the Traitors negative, or could there be a reading of it that is more left-friendly? Let's find out. There are, of course, elements of and readings of the Traitors that could be useful to a left viewpoint. What if we take the Traitors as an opportunity to explore society, our relationship to power, and to consider what stops us from being able to progress past capitalism? It can be seen as a useful warning against embracing the more problematic elements presented by the show, as well as a means for explaining things like class interest and solidarity. We have already spoken a little about unconscious bias and the role that prejudice can play when talking of suspicion and mistrust, and the Traitors is an excellent tool for shining a light on behaviour that many would miss. The microaggressions of language throughout and the coincidental suspicions placed on non-white contestants early on in each season are something to think on, as is the filing of female contestants into clumsily transparent social roles by male contestants. These are all red flags that can be used to highlight areas in need of examination as an individual and as a society. And let's be real, the UK could really use some self-examination on a number of subjects to really test those claims that we're somehow less racist, sexist or homophobic than mainland Europe or the US. I think many would be surprised if faced with the truth when presented this way. A season review show perhaps, where the contestants host and some independent observers sit down and analyse some of the problematic moments and talk through the thought processes involved, in a non-blame assigning way, to examine how easily prejudice can present itself in ways other than the obvious. I also think the Traitors can be a useful learning tool to talk about class interests, solidarity and exploitation. In this game, a minority of people have more information, power and control, and manipulate that imbalance to ensure that they're able to steal the money produced by the collective. Or to put it in a more provocative way, they leverage a systematic advantage to extract the value created by others. Wait, are we going to talk about surplus value? No explicit Marxism this time, but it's still an interesting talking point, isn't it? All of this seems like an ideal way to demonstrate class interests. It does, however, mean incriminating Claudia Winkleman as part of the traitor class, though, since it is Claudia, and those she works for, that pick who receives that advantage. Sorry, Claudia. When you look at the dynamics with the traitors removed, it is essentially a group of people living together and acting as a team to build a shared reward. And I mean, that is pretty wholesome, isn't it?
Let's go! Not long left!
Everybody worked, everybody put 100% in. It was just brilliant.
So close! To the finish! We're so close! You did it! You absolutely did it! Well done.
That was amazing, wasn't it? Well done, mate. We smashed it.
Yeah, where are all these endorphins everyone keeps banging on about?
The anarcho-syndicalists is a slightly more challenging brand to market, I will give you that. And is it as compelling a watch, though? That's a difficult one. But I think you can build an official antagonist, like you see in The Chase, for example, that could fulfill that role and maintain the tension and the drama. There can still be competitive elements, of course, just without the need for betrayal or murder between the contestants. There is something inherently fascinating about watching people interact, especially when there are stakes. The anarchist in me thinks that watching a group of people new to each other and with no established hierarchy, working together, utilising their collective strengths and knowledge for the benefit of all of them, well, I mean, it has a charm to it, doesn't it? It's solidarity, it's community. When thinking about game shows that demonstrate more of this type of behaviour, my mind went straight to one of the great British game shows, The Crystal Maze. For those unfortunate souls who have not seen Crystal Maze, I will give you a quick rundown, though much like the viewing public, I am choosing to ignore the more recent reboot presented by transphobia-endorsing Richard Ayoade. The Crystal Maze was a British TV show that aired from 1990 to 1995, and as far as I'm concerned, that's where it finished. It was originally presented by riffraff themselves, Richard O'Brien, who, let's be real, made the show way more entertaining than it would have been otherwise. What a treasure, as per this from O'Brien in an interview with BuzzFeed. When we got very macho people on, someone from the police or fire service or something or other, I'd always make sure I take them by the hand and they couldn't do anything about it. It's a very camp thing to do. I knew damn well that on television all their mates are going to see them running with Richard holding their hand. I liked that. Honourable mention for subsequent presenter Ed Tudor-Pole, who also did their best to maintain the weird but entertaining vibe, and all without providing quotes for Graham Linehan's book. The Crystal Maze was basically a series of challenges based in one of the 4 historically themed areas, with contestants trying to win crystals that gave them more time in the Crystal Dome to try and win a prize. It was a visually arresting show, with the lavishly decorated and themed sets, dynamic editing and production whipping viewers through the show at a hell of a pace, all led by Richard O'Brien's weirdly captivating and charismatic jester style, as per O'Brien themselves in that same interview from BuzzFeed. I just started talking into the camera about anything. I was just trying to make the cameraman laugh, and as soon as I saw the camera shaking on his shoulders, I'd look back at the clock and say, okay, half a minute to go. They didn't know they had any of these asides until they came to edit the series together, and once they did, they realised how that worked. A quick cutaway of me saying they'll never manage this, or I'd pull out the harmonica, and unknowingly it added a complicity between me and the audience at home, because I was looking straight into the camera. I never did it when the contestants were there, only when their backs were turned. This is important. as it added to the feeling that O'Brien was talking to us, involving us in what was happening. It was a weirdly fourth wall breaking trick, and it all came about because Richard O'Brien is an experienced entertainer and couldn't help but perform when there was an audience. And this theme of us, the audience, being invited in to be part of the show, stood in direct contrast to the somewhat more aloof direction of the hosts of the UK and Australian Traitors, who are very much distant from the audience, even when Claudia does occasional parts to the camera.
And as the faithful retire to their beds, for our traitors, sleep is the last thing on their minds. Tonight, 3 become 4. So who is the final traitor? And more importantly, who will be their first victim?
The audience of the Traitors are treated as a neutral party, an informed majority perhaps, to go back to Dmitry Davidov's language, but we are very much observers and treated as such, viewing events from largely fixed cameras or from an army of mobile camera people with expensive stabilisation technology. This fourth dimensional distance can't be broken just because for certain parts the host is addressing the camera. It simply feels like what it is, a choice of shot, rather than a genuine attempt to invite the viewer to base themselves in this setting. The Crystal Maze, on the other hand, had a guy trying to keep up with Richard O'Brien, hauling a great 90s TV camera about and acting as an avatar for the viewer, receiving the asides and commentary from Richard O'Brien on a personal level, as opposed to a planned camera piece. This audience involvement extended to the general culture of the show, where 6 random people were put together to try and win either a predetermined individual prize each or a shared haul, meaning that the success of the one was predicated on the success of all. This meant that the viewer didn't have to pick a side or cheer on a specific contestant, since they were all working together, along with Richard O'Brien to some degree, to defeat the maze itself, really. It was a people versus system dynamic. The contestants were attempting to overcome tasks that were set up by the Crystal Maze, with O'Brien representing both the maze and the contestants kind of simultaneously, but generally edging towards the humans, no matter how unknowable his character at times. Unlike the Traitors, where the celebrated behaviours were spotting lying, politicking and manipulation, success in the Crystal Maze meant being able to work as a team, to communicate effectively and to sublimate ego for the good of the team. It didn't always work that way, of course, but the teams that succeeded to any degree in the Crystal Maze were the ones that quickly understood the importance of shared knowledge, responsibility and support. With the Crystal Maze, there was a shared prize, a shared responsibility and a shared experience, and as such it encouraged behaviours that are largely beneficial to a more communal view of humanity, and it managed to entertain without having to pit contestants against each other for the entertainment of a distant audience, as if we were watching gladiators in the Colosseum. There is no denying that the cutthroat drama and tension of the Traitors is entertaining, and competition is a big part of entertainment more widely. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise. But there are ways to create entertainment that don't rely on the worst human behaviours to be successful. Winning by being better at something positive has to be preferable to winning by being prepared to be the worst, surely. How important is a game show? And should we even care about them beyond basic entertainment? I think so. I think anything that can be broadcast to 6 million pairs of eyes should be considered in terms of its cultural impact and how it might affect the minds of those that perceive it. When we think about terms like social reproduction, like British values and like cultural influence, it is hard to not examine the power of a show like The Traitors and to wonder what part it plays in the national mindset and how it fits into the patchwork of different media influences on the future of the country. There is no denying that human conflict, drama and antagonism is entertaining, and the success of The Traitors makes clear that people want to see this kind of thing. But something being entertaining does not preclude it from being examined as to its value as an ideological piece. The fact remains that for the UK and the wider world, to improve the lives for the majority, we need to explore different forms of governance, of economic distribution, and to examine new priorities for humankind. That is only possible if those other ways of living are part of our conversations, within the Overton window and within the cultural landscape. And that can be as big and directly political as topics like nationalisation and UBI, or as small and indirect as the principles and values that we learn to treasure via our favourite media. media. It is easy to overstate the importance of our media on shaping us directly, the ridiculous hysteria surrounding violence and video games being the classic example. But I do think that the media you grow up with will shape part of your worldview. I was a young adult when Dragon's Den and The Apprentice were the shows being talked about at work, and I remember thinking that I should find a way to be successful, whatever that means, reading books by shitehouses like Branson and Bannatyne because that's what I thought you were supposed to do. That's just me, of course. However, can anyone really deny that high-profile TV shows presented by a public broadcaster like the BBC, heavily marketed and talked about everywhere, can anyone really argue that it doesn't have an impact? And what impact is it having when we are celebrating lying, manipulation, ruthlessness and selfishness precisely when the world needs more kindness, community, collaboration and understanding? I don't know, as I have an answer. I've watched the UK seasons 1 and 2, Australia seasons 1 and 2, and I'm now onto the American series. I've enjoyed watching the show. It is an entertaining, well-made and well-presented show in any of its formats, but a doubt remains in my mind about whether shows like The Traitors are good for us. What do you think? Am I worrying too much about a nothing issue? Or is our taste in game shows indicative of a wider decline in leftist values of solidarity and kinship? Let me know in the comments. Thank you to all of you who took the time to watch this video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like and send it to a friend who might also find it interesting. If you didn't like it or just think I'm overreacting, thank you for watching anyway, and you are probably right. Thank you to Mrs. Inside Left for her help with the script and for being my rock as ever. Thank you to all of the We Create Together crew who helped with the video idea and suggestions for sources and comparable media. This year I would really like to hit 1,000 subscribers, that's my target. I can't do that without you guys watching the videos and making them worthy of the algorithm's love. So thank you for watching, and I hope I will see you all again very soon. Be good, comrades, take care of each other, and remember, kindness is a gift that costs nothing. Bye for now.